Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight we journey to the wind-swept shores of the Scottish Islands, where villages once thrived in isolation, their lives intertwined with the rhythm of the sea. Now, abandoned and weathered by the relentless salt air, these forgotten places hold a quiet beauty, reclaimed by nature. The stone cottages, their roofs long since collapsed, stand as silent witnesses to lives once lived, whispers of children's laughter, the sound of boats and the soft murmur of the tide still echoing in the wind. So before you drift into sleep, take a moment to like and subscribe, only if this brought you calm. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. On the western edge of the Scottish Islands, where the sea meets the rocky shore, there are villages that once hummed with life, small, isolated communities built along the wind-battered coastline. Today, many of these villages lie abandoned, their homes weathered by the relentless salt air, their streets now silent except for the occasional cry of a seabird. These forgotten villages, scattered across the islands, tell a story of resilience, hardship, and a way of life that has slowly slipped away from the present, leaving only traces of the people who once called these rugged shores home. The Scottish Islands, with their dramatic landscapes, towering cliffs, and sweeping moors, have always been a land of isolation. For centuries, the people who lived here were self-sufficient, relying on the land and the sea to survive. The villages, often small and clustered along the shores, were places where families lived close to nature, their lives shaped by the tides, the winds, and the ever-changing seasons. In these communities, every day was a battle against the elements, and survival required hard work and an unyielding connection to the land and sea. But over time, things began to change. The world beyond the islands crept closer, bringing with it the promise of new opportunities, new ways of life, and new technologies. The villages that once thrived on the islands slowly began to empty as the younger generations left to seek work elsewhere, lured by the promise of a better life. The land, which had once been the lifeblood of these communities, could no longer sustain the people in the same way. The isolation that had once been a source of pride became a burden, and the harsh realities of island life drove many to seek new homes. Today, these abandoned villages stand as haunting reminders of the past. The cottages, built from stone and thatch, have fallen into disrepair, their roofs caved in and their walls crumbling. The narrow streets, once filled with the sounds of daily life, are now overgrown with brambles and wildflowers. The harbours, which once bustled with boats and fishermen, are now empty, their docks slowly rotting away. Yet, despite their abandonment, there is something beautiful and peaceful about these forgotten places. They seem frozen in time, holding on to the memories of the lives that once filled them. Walking through one of these villages, you can still feel the presence of those who once lived there. The echoes of their lives linger in the air, carried by the wind that sweeps across the empty streets. You can almost hear the voices of children playing in the fields, the laughter of families gathered around the hearth, and the rhythmic sound of the boats being hauled ashore after a long day of fishing. The land and the sea have absorbed the memories of the people who once lived here, and in these quiet, empty villages, those memories still seem to pulse beneath the surface. Each abandoned village has its own story, shaped by the people who once called it home. Some were fishing villages, where generations of families made their living from the sea. Others were agricultural communities, where crops were grown and livestock tended to. Some were simply small hamlets, isolated and self-sufficient, where life revolved around the ebb and flow of the seasons. but all were places where the people had a deep connection to the land and the sea, and each village reflects that bond in its architecture, its layout, and its location. The homes in these villages are simple, yet beautiful in their own way. Many are built from local stone, with thick walls designed to keep out the cold winds that sweep across the islands. The roofs, once thatched, have long since collapsed, leaving the skeletal frames of the buildings exposed. Some houses still have remnants of their past lives. An old wooden door, a broken window, a rusted farming tool left behind in the yard. These small details offer a glimpse into the lives of the people who once lived here, allowing us to imagine what their days were like, what their struggles were, and what they might have dreamed for the future. The beauty of these abandoned villages is not just in their architecture, but in the way they are slowly being reclaimed by nature. The once pristine gardens are now wild with overgrown grass and creeping vines, and the stone walls are softened by moss and lichen. The sea, ever changing and unpredictable, continues to lap at the shores, eroding the coastline and bringing the salt air that once shaped the lives of the villages. In a way, these villages are being returned to the earth, as if the land is taking back what was once hers. There is a quiet peace to be found in these abandoned villages. The hustle and bustle of modern life seems far away, and the only sounds are the whispers of the wind, the calls of seabirds, and the gentle movement of the tide. In the stillness, it is easy to imagine what life was once like here, to picture the people who lived and worked in these villages, their faces weathered by the elements, their hands rough from years of hard labor. But even in their abandonment, the villages are not entirely empty. They are still inhabited, in a sense, by the memories of the people who once lived there. The walls, though crumbling, still stand as silent witnesses to the lives that were once lived within them. The fields, though untended, still hold the echoes of past harvests. The harbors, though silent, still reflect the passage of time. These abandoned villages may no longer be home to the people who once lived there, but they are not forgotten. The lives of those who came before still linger in the air, carried by the winds and the waves. As we leave these forgotten shores, there is a quiet sense of gratitude for the lives that were once lived here. These abandoned villages, though empty, are still full of life in the stories they tell, in the memories they hold, and in the beauty of the land and sea that shaped them. And as the wind picks up and the mist rolls in from the sea, it feels as though the villages themselves are whispering their final farewell, urging us to remember them and the people who once called them home. As we wander through the abandoned village, the stillness of the streets is both peaceful and haunting. The houses, though in varying states of disrepair, hold memories within their walls. Each stone, each fragment of thatched roof left behind tells the story of lives once full of activity, of people who loved, worked, and struggled under the same winds and skies that continue to sweep across the island today. The streets are empty, save for the occasional flash of wildlife darting between the buildings. But in their emptiness lies the pulse of the past. The cottages, once bustling with families, are now open to the elements. The wood of the doors has split, the glass of the windows shattered, and yet you can still sense the presence of those who lived here. The floorboards creak with the weight of history, though no one walks there now. In one corner of a long-abandoned kitchen, a rusted iron pot still rests atop the hearth, as if left in the middle of a meal. In another house, an old chair lies tipped over beside a small wooden table. The belongings are simple, but they reflect a life lived here, perhaps not luxurious, but full of warmth and purpose. We pause by one of the old homes, its stone walls still standing strong against the harsh winds of the island. Overgrown vines snake their way up the structure, creeping across the roof, their green tendrils seeking to reclaim the space that humans once inhabited. The air is heavy with the smell of damp earth and sea salt, and the silence is only broken by the distant cry of a seabird. If you close your eyes, it's not hard to imagine the echoes of children laughing in the yard, the sounds of boots on cobblestone, and the chatter of daily life filling the air. But even in its silence, there is something beautiful about this abandonment. The natural world has begun to reclaim the village. Flowers and grasses have grown in the cracks of the stone streets, adding a burst of color to the otherwise muted landscape. Small trees, once saplings, have grown into sturdy trunks, their branches reaching up toward the sky, as if they too are remembering what once was. The land once worked by the villagers' hands now works to restore itself, bringing new life into the spaces left behind. The village's once thriving harbors, now deserted, are equally poignant. The piers are in ruins, their wooden planks weathered and broken by years of relentless waves. Here, the sea has not just provided livelihood for generations of villagers, it has also taken back what was once its own. The salt water has softened the edges of the stone piers, worn them smooth as though the sea is gently erasing all signs of the people who once worked here. Yet, as the tide moves in and out, it feels as if the harbor still holds a memory of the past, of boats that once bobbed in the water, of fishermen who cast their nets under the early morning sun, and of families waiting for the return of their loved ones after a long day at sea. These harbors, abandoned and forgotten by time, now serve as quiet witnesses to the changing tides of history. The ebb and flow of the sea, which once marked the rhythm of daily life, continues on, indifferent to the absence of the villagers. The water laps at the edges of the docks, the sound soothing and rhythmic, but there is no ship to come in, no voice to greet the sailors. The village may be empty, but the sea still carries the same tides, the same waves that once brought the villagers their livelihood and their sustenance. As we continue through the village, we find that there is beauty even in the crumbling structures, the faded paint on the walls, the peeling shutters on windows long closed, and the cracked stone walls that have stood for generations. These remnants, though weathered by time, hold the essence of what was once a vibrant community. There are traces of life everywhere, hidden beneath the dust and decay. The villager's heart is still present, lingering in the land, in the memories, and in the very stones that remain standing. As we walk further, we come upon what was once the center of the village, a small, humble church, now abandoned. Its door hangs slightly ajar, the wooden frame warped from years of exposure to the elements. Inside, the pews are still arranged neatly, though some have been tipped over or broken. The altar, though dusty, remains intact, the stone steps worn smooth from years of use. Faded icons hang on the walls, their colors muted by the passage of time. The smell of old wood and dampness fills the air, but there is a sense of reverence that still lingers within these walls. This church, though empty, is a silent witness to the faith that once bound the villagers together. The prayers that once echoed through this space, the weddings, the baptisms, the funerals, they are now only memories, carried in the hearts of those who once gathered here. In the empty church, the silence is overwhelming, but it is also peaceful. The stillness of the space invites reflection, a quiet moment to honor the lives that once filled these rooms. And as we step back outside, The sun begins to dip low in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the village. The shadows stretch across the broken streets, and the soft breeze carries the scent of the sea. There is a sense of closure as we look around, as though the village itself is at peace, resting quietly in the embrace of time and nature. These abandoned villages, though forgotten by most, continue to hold the stories of those who lived and worked here. Their lives, their struggles, and their joys are embedded in the very soil, the very stones and the very air. The villages may be gone, but their presence lingers, a quiet reminder that life, even in its most humble forms, leaves its mark on the land. As we leave the village behind, the sea continues to lap at the shore, the wind continues to blow through the empty streets, and the village, though silent, continues to whisper its stories. The abandoned villages of the Scottish Islands are not just remnants of the past. They are the living memory of a way of life that has passed, but not been forgotten. The wind picks up as we continue our journey through the abandoned villages, now fully immersed in the rhythm of the sea and the whispers of the past. The once bustling settlements are quiet, but there is an undeniable energy that still lingers in the air. It's as if the land itself holds the memories of the people who once lived here, and the wind that sweeps through the empty streets carries those memories across the island, from one ruin to the next. The houses may be empty, the roofs caved in by years of neglect, but the stories of those who lived here are embedded in the very soil. The faintest impression of life can be felt in the worn stones beneath our feet, the overgrown gardens that once nurtured families, and the moss-covered walls that once sheltered children from the cold winds of the sea. If you stand still enough and close your eyes, it's not difficult to imagine the echoes of laughter, of voices calling across the streets, of the creak of wooden doors opening and closing, of people living their lives within these walls. One of the most poignant aspects of these villages is the sense of community that still lingers despite the absence of people. The small stone houses, which were once filled with families, still stand together, a cluster of homes that once shared the same heartbeat. The communal spirit that defined these settlements is evident in the layout of the village. The homes, though simple, were arranged with care, often centered around a shared hearth or a communal garden. The closeness of the villagers to one another is reflected in the way these homes are connected to the land, shaped by the same forces of nature that dictated their way of life. As we walk further into the village, we approach an old stone well, still standing, though cracked and weathered by time. The well, once a vital source of water, now serves as a silent witness to the lives of those who lived here. It was here that villagers would have gathered, exchanging news and gossip as they drew water from its depth. It's easy to imagine the community that once surrounded this simple, everyday object, a place where lives intersected, where the rhythms of daily life were played out in the smallest of actions. The well may be dry now, but it remains a central point in the village, a reminder of the connection between people and the land that sustained them. Nearby, the remnants of an old barn stand half collapsed, its beams sagging under the weight of time. The barn, which once stored the fruits of the land, hay, grain, and tools, now serves as a symbol of the self-sufficiency that defined these communities. The villagers grew their own food, raised their own animals, and built their own homes. Life here was hard, but it was also a life of deep connection to the land, to the sea, and to one another. There was little room for luxury or indulgence. Every action was focused on survival, on sustaining the community through the harshest of conditions. But the harshness of island life also created a strong sense of unity. The people of these villages were bound together by their reliance on the sea and the land. They knew that their survival depended on one another, And this understanding created a bond that was unspoken but deeply felt. The close-knit nature of these communities is reflected in the architecture, in the way the homes are positioned together, in the shared spaces, and in the common purpose that unified the people. Now, though, these bonds are broken. The silence of the village is deafening, and the wind that once carried the sounds of life now carries only the memory of it. The emptiness is palpable, yet the spirit of the past remains, subtly woven into the fabric of the place. The sea continues to crash against the rocks, the waves rolling in and out with a rhythm that has remained unchanged for centuries. And in this rhythm, there are echoes of the villagers who once lived here, who once relied on the sea and the land to survive. In some ways, the abandonment of these villages seems to reflect the passing of time itself. The people who lived here were part of a way of life that is slowly fading into history. The world has moved on, and the isolation that once defined these islands is no longer a necessary part of life. But while the people may be gone, the connection to the land, to the sea, and to the past remains. The villages, though abandoned, still hold the stories of those who lived here. They are a living memorial to a way of life that has disappeared, but is not forgotten. As we stand in the empty streets, the wind howling through the open windows of abandoned homes, it is easy to feel a sense of reverence for the people who once walked these paths. The villages may be empty, but their history is rich and enduring. The villagers who once lived here may have left, but their legacy lingers in the land, in the buildings, and in the stories that are still told. And though the island may seem quiet now, if you listen closely, you can still hear the echoes of their lives, carried by the wind, across the silent streets and over the forgotten shores. As the evening draws near, the mist begins to settle over the village, enveloping it in a blanket of quiet. The sea continues its eternal rhythm, and the village stands, silent but full of life, in ways that only the land can understand. As we move deeper into the heart of the abandoned village, it becomes clear that time has left its mark on these once thriving communities. Yet traces of the past are woven into every corner. The wind whispers through the narrow streets, stirring up the occasional scattering of fallen leaves. But beneath that wind, there is something else, something like a murmur, faint yet persistent. It feels as though the very air here is steeped in memories. The forgotten voices of the villagers still carried on the breeze. The more we walk through these silent streets, the more we can sense the presence of lives once lived here, ghosts not of spirits, but of stories, of families, and of a way of life that, though no longer visible, is still very much alive in the land. The island's people were not just surviving, they were part of a culture steeped in deep connection to their heritage. The villagers, though isolated, had their own networks and traditions that tied them not just to each other, but to the larger communities scattered across the islands. In these forgotten homes, you can almost hear the hum of conversation that once filled the rooms. The stories passed from generation to generation. From the hearthside, there would have been tales of the sea stories, of fishing boats caught in storms, of lucky catches, of families making do with what the land provided. There are also stories of the land, the crops grown in the rocky soil, the weather that shaped everything, the long winters that brought isolation, but also a deep bond with the seasons and the rhythms of nature. There were once voices in these empty rooms, telling stories late into the evening. At the table, families would have shared their meals, spoken of their day's labor, and woven the fabric of their lives into the tapestry of the village's history. Perhaps the most enduring of these stories were those of the sea, for the ocean was both a sustainer and a threat. For centuries, islanders lived and died by the sea, The sea provided fish, seaweed, and salt. It was the lifeblood of these villages, as it had been for the generations that came before. But the sea was also unpredictable, harsh, and at times unforgiving. In one home, we find a wooden chest left behind, its lid cracked open by time. Inside, there are remnants of a life lived here. Old fishing nets, rusted hooks, a pair of weathered boots that once trudged through the sand. Each item is a link to the stories of those who lived here, stories that will never be told again except by those of us who pause long enough to listen to the land. The sea may have carried away some of these people, but the traces they left behind tell a tale of survival, of struggle, and of quiet resilience in the face of forces far beyond their control. There are also smaller, quieter stories, the lives of the women who kept the homes, who tended the gardens and the animals, who cared for the children while the men were at sea. Their stories are often more subtle, but no less important. It was the women who kept the communities going when the men were away. They made the clothes, tended the fires, and ensured that food was ready when the men returned from their long days at sea. And as we walk through the village, we can almost see the women, bent over baskets, weaving or washing clothes by the edge of a stream, speaking to one another in hushed voices, sharing the load of daily life. Though the village is now empty, there are small remnants of the daily lives that once unfolded here. A broken bowl left behind in a kitchen hints at the meals once shared here. A crooked, abandoned ladder leans against a wall, perhaps left after a day of work on the roof. These small, intimate traces of life are what make these places so poignant. They are reminders that life, even in its most humble form, is full of meaning, and even in the silence of these ruins, the echoes of those who lived here continue to reverberate. In these villages, the passing of time is not marked by the clock, but by the rhythm of the seasons. The villagers knew the land and the sea in ways that we may never understand. They knew the signs of the changing weather, the cycles of the moon, and the tides that dictated when to fish and when to harvest. Their lives were inextricably linked to the natural world around them. They understood the land's moods, its harsh winters, its brief summers, and the way the sea could calm and rage in the same breath. As we walk further, we find a small burial ground on the edge of the village, the gravestones worn and weathered, their inscriptions faded by the years. Some of the stones are still standing, though many have toppled or been overtaken by the growth of moss and lichen. This cemetery, though neglected, still holds the names of the villagers who once lived and died here. The islanders knew their ancestors were never far away, and this resting place, where the dead were interred in the shadow of the land and sea, held deep spiritual significance. The sense of connection between the villagers and the land was so profound that even in death they were not far from home. The sense of community in these villages may be gone, but the traces of it are still present in the land. The gravestones, the abandoned homes, the overgrown paths, all of these are small, quiet reminders of the lives that once filled these places. The people who lived here may no longer walk these streets, but they have not been forgotten. Their stories, whispered on the wind and carried by the waves, are still part of the fabric of the island. Though the villages are gone, their legacy remains in the land, in the very stones of the houses they built, and in the memories that echo in the quiet spaces they left behind. And as we leave the abandoned village behind, we pause for a moment to listen, to honor those who once lived here. The wind stirs the tall grasses, the sea laps at the shore, and the faintest sound of life seems to rise from the earth. In this quiet, peaceful place, the ghosts of the past live on, not as specters, but as memories carried by the land itself. As the sun begins to set over the empty village, casting a golden glow across the scattered remains of homes. It is easy to understand why those who lived here clung so fiercely to their home. The island, though harsh and unforgiving, offered a deep, unspoken connection to both the land and the sea. For centuries, families lived on these isolated shores, passing down their traditions, their knowledge, and their way of life. But as the years went by, fewer and fewer people remained, and slowly the village emptied, the last of the islanders disappearing into the mainland, seeking a different future. Yet, even now, there are whispers of those who remained behind, the last of the islanders who chose to stay, even as the world around them changed. These final few, stubbornly clinging to the land that had sustained their families for generations, became a symbol of resilience, a testament to the bond between the people and the place they called home. It is said that even in the face of modernity, they lived simply, much like their ancestors, relying on the sea for sustenance and the land for shelter. Their lives were marked by the same rhythms as the village before them: the rise of the tide, the call of the seabirds, and the slow passage of time. Some of the last islanders were fishermen, venturing out on the same boats that had once been used by their fathers and grandfathers. They set their nets in the same waters that had fed generations before them, harvesting fish that would be smoked or dried for the long winters. Others tended to the land, growing hardy crops that could survive the unforgiving climate, raising livestock, and gathering what the sea and land had to offer. Their days were long and filled with labor, but there was a certain peace in the simplicity of their lives. The challenges they faced were immense, but they were born of necessity, not choice. The land demanded respect, but it also gave generously to those who knew how to live with it. One of the most striking stories of the last islanders is that of an elderly woman who lived in one of the abandoned cottages long after the village had been emptied. She was the final resident of the village, the last to leave, and even when the rest of the islanders had gone, she remained. She tended to her small garden, fished the waters, and lived a life that mirrored the generations before her. It is said that, in her later years, she was often seen walking the shores, her weathered face turned toward the horizon, as if waiting for something or someone to return. There are even rumors that, during the harshest winters, she would light a fire in the hearth of her cottage, hoping for the return of the community that had once lived here. She passed away quietly, in the home that had been in her family for generations, but her memory lives on in the stories passed down by the few remaining islanders who remember her. The life of the last islanders was not one of grand adventure or heroic feats. It was, instead, a quiet life of perseverance. They understood that the island offered no luxuries, but in its simplicity, there was an undeniable beauty. The sea provided sustenance, but it also took away. The land offered shelter, but it demanded labor. The cycle of life here was one of balance, of taking only what was necessary and giving back what was left. The islanders, with their connection to the land and the sea, lived in harmony with their surroundings, knowing that to thrive on the island was to respect its ancient rhythms. Even today, long after the last of the islanders have gone, the village continues to speak to those who wander through its streets. The bones of the houses, though broken and worn, still tell the story of a life lived in connection to the land. The gardens, overgrown but still teeming with life, are a reminder of the hard work and dedication that once went into cultivating the island's soil. The boats, now abandoned on the shore, are silent witnesses to the fishing traditions that once sustained the village. These stories, though fading with time, are still alive in the landscape. They live in the stones of the homes, in the rusted tools left behind, in the forgotten graveyard where the islanders were laid to rest. The lives of the last islanders may have ended, but their legacy continues to echo through the windswept streets, carried by the sea and the land they once called home. In these quiet, abandoned villages, there is a certain kind of peace. The noise of the modern world has not reached here, and the land remains unchanged by the passage of time. The wind still blows across the empty streets, the tide still rises and falls, and the sea continues to stretch out before us, its vastness both daunting and calming. Here in the abandoned villages of the Scottish Islands, the last islanders' lives continue in the whispers of the wind, the songs of the seabirds, and the steady rhythm of the waves that have always defined these shores. The tide shifts with a slow, measured rhythm, as though the sea itself is breathing. It laps gently against the stone piers of the abandoned harbour, its salt water creeping across the rocks, reclaiming what was once shaped by human hands. Time here feels suspended, with the land and sea locked in an eternal cycle, neither one yielding to the other. In this quiet, desolate place, nature is quietly erasing the traces of human life. Slowly, steadily, but without hurry, the stone homes, once filled with the laughter of families, the sounds of work, the warmth of hearth fires, are now crumbling under the weight of time. Yet, even in their ruin, there's a beauty, an untold story that nature is allowing to flourish once again. The abandoned village, though left to the forces of time, does not feel entirely empty. The land is slowly swallowing it whole, as though nature is taking back what was always hers, erasing the remnants of human history in a quiet, determined way. The grasses grow thick through the cracks in the stone streets, wildflowers break through where walls once stood, and trees reach their limbs into the hearts of old homes. The once clear paths now wind through tangled undergrowth, leaving only faint reminders of where people once walked, side by side. As the years go by, the village becomes more and more a part of the land itself. Nature breathes new life into what was once human-made, its vines and roots weaving through the stone foundations, claiming them as her own. The sea, too, plays its part, its salt water creeping ever closer to the land, pushing back the man-made boundaries, as though quietly reminding the earth that all is temporary. The wind carries the scent of the sea, the sharp tang of salt, mingling with the earthy smells of moss, stone and overgrown grass. Yet, in this quiet reclamation, there's an undeniable sense of continuity. The sea and the land have always been in a state of change, and though the village is now abandoned, the rhythm of life that once existed here has not entirely vanished. The wind whispers through the trees, and the sea continues to call to those who listen. In the rustling of leaves, in the crackling of branches, there are traces of the voices that once filled these streets. Even as the land reclaims the village, it holds the memory of the lives that lived here, the hard work and sacrifices made, and the bonds forged between people and nature. We pass by one of the old homes, its roof long since collapsed, leaving only the skeleton of its walls standing against the elements. Yet, as we walk closer, we see that nature has taken over in its own way. Ivy curls around the stone, covering the openings, where windows once framed the views of the sea, where the sunlight once streamed in. The vibrant green of the ivy stands in contrast to the grey stones, bringing a sense of life to a place that seems so still. It's as if the building is quietly being embraced by nature, enveloped by it, and allowed to slowly dissolve into the landscape. Looking closer, we can see the faint outline of a flower bed, long untended, where wildflowers now grow. Some of the plants here have been present for years, thriving in their own way, continuing to bloom even without care. It's an echo of the village's once vibrant gardens, of people who worked the soil, grew food, and lived their lives in harmony with the land. In the quiet of the abandoned village, nature's take-back is not an act of destruction but of transformation, offering new life in places where people once planted seeds. This transformation is a testament to the land's strength, its ability to endure and regenerate even after human life fades away. The island is resilient, as it has always been. Whether with human help or without it, nature will continue to grow, shift, and thrive. The sea will continue to lap against the shores. The wind will continue to sweep over the hills, and the rain will continue to nourish the soil. The village may be gone, but the land and the sea will continue as they always have. Further along the shore, we come across the remnants of the old fishing boats. Once the lifeblood of the islanders, these boats were once a familiar sight in the harbour, used to gather the sea's bounty and connect the village to the wider world. Now, they lie abandoned, their wooden frames cracked and weathered, half buried by sand and seaweed. The sea has left its mark on them, eroding their edges, softening their once sturdy hulls. The boats, like the village, are being returned to the earth in their own way. Yet, there's a beauty in their decay. They are a part of the island now, shaped by both the hands that built them and the sea that claimed them. As we stand on the shore, watching the tide come in, we are reminded of the delicate balance between nature and human life. The village may be empty, but its spirit remains in the land, in the sea, and in the remnants of the past. The islanders may have left, but their connection to this place is not easily erased. The boats, the homes, the fields, they are all part of the island's story, part of the island's soul, and part of a life that continues even after people are gone. The sea has not forgotten the village. The land has not forgotten the village. And even though the last islanders are no longer here to walk these streets, their story is carried by the island, by the sea, by the wind, and by the land that embraced them. As we stand at the edge of the village, looking out over the open sea, there's a profound sense of stillness that fills the air. The wind blows across the open stretch of land, carrying with it the faint scent of the ocean and the earth, a scent that feels timeless, eternal, as though it has been here long before humans walked this land and will remain long after we are gone. The land, despite the passing of generations, is ever changing, ever growing, and yet it remains anchored in its essence, a quiet, steadfast witness to the lives that once unfolded here. The cycle of life and death that marked the village is no different from the land's own cycles. Where people once sowed seeds in the soil, nature now grows wild. Where the boats once floated in the harbour, now the sea quietly reclaims its own. The island has learned to live without its people, but it does so not out of indifference. Instead, it offers a reminder that the earth, though it changes, never truly forgets. The land has become its own repository for the memories of those who lived here, storing them in the winds, the waves, the sun, and the soil. The abandoned village, though quiet and solitary now, continues to carry the stories of its people, of those who left and of those who stayed. It is as if the very stones worn by time are part of an ongoing conversation, a conversation between the past and the present, between the land and its caretakers. The stories of the village are etched into the landscape itself, and the wind, as it sweeps across the moors, carries with it whispers of those who lived and worked here. It's as if nature has become the keeper of those stories, holding them gently, allowing them to breathe within the land, as the island quietly grows, slowly reclaiming what was once its own. In the distant hills, we can see the remnants of ancient stone walls, their shapes barely discernible beneath the thick carpet of moss and brambles. These walls, built centuries ago, are reminders of a different time, a time when the island was a thriving community, not just of families, but of generations who worked in tandem with the island, knowing its rhythms and respecting its power. Though these walls no longer serve their original purpose, they still stand, silent and unmoving, as if to remind us that, in the end, it is not the buildings that define a place, but the people who shape it and the land that endures. As the sun dips lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the village, we take a moment to reflect on the lives that once filled these empty homes. The people who lived here were not defined by the island's isolation or the harsh conditions. Instead, they were defined by their deep connection to the place, their resilience in the face of the elements, and their ability to create a life out of nothing but the land and the sea. They were people who worked hard, who fought to survive, and who found meaning in the simplest of things: a meal shared, a roof over their heads, a family to call their own. The legacy of the islanders is not just in the stone walls they built, the boats they sailed, or the gardens they tended, but in the way they lived in harmony with the land. They understood that the land was not theirs to conquer, but theirs to care for, to nurture, and to live alongside. The islanders knew the rhythms of the tides, the seasons, and the winds. They knew the landscape, the changing of the weather, and the ways the sea could be both a provider and a taker. They lived their lives in reverence for these forces, understanding that survival was never guaranteed, but always earned. Now, with the village empty, the land returns to its natural state. The once carefully cultivated gardens are now overgrown with brambles. The harbour is slowly filled with sand, and the houses, abandoned and forgotten, slowly crumble. Yet, even in this quiet dissolution, there is a kind of beauty. The island does not mourn the loss of its people. Instead, it continues to thrive in its own way, offering a home to the wild things that now roam the land. The birds still nest in the empty houses, the foxes tread the overgrown paths, and the flowers bloom in the cracks of the stone. In a sense, the island continues its own quiet, peaceful existence, undisturbed by the passing of time and the departure of its human inhabitants. Perhaps, in the end, this is the island's greatest legacy, that it does not forget, and that it continues to carry the memory of those who lived here. The spirits of the past may no longer walk these streets, but they are present in every corner of the village, in the stones, the sea, and the soil. The island has become a keeper of memory, not just for those who once called it home, but for all those who have come and gone, leaving behind a piece of themselves in the land. As we leave the village behind and the sea continues to whisper its eternal rhythm, we are left with a quiet sense of awe for the land and its enduring story. Though the people are gone, the island remains, carrying with it the echoes of a time long past. The memories of the villagers will live on, not in monuments or grand structures, but in the very fabric of the island itself. And as the wind carries those memories across the shore, it's easy to imagine that, in some quiet corner of this forgotten village, the voices of the past still linger, forever carried by the sea. The island, with its abandoned village and fading remnants of the past, stands as a testament to the resilience of both nature and memory. The sea still laps gently at the shore, the wind still whispers across the moors, and the empty streets of the village, though silent, seem to hold a quiet story, a story of people who lived here, of lives shaped by the land and the sea. It is in these quiet moments, as we walk away from the village, that the weight of its history settles in, a history that may be forgotten by most, but which continues to resonate in the land itself. The island's transformation into a place of solitude and peace is not an end, but rather a quiet continuation of its natural cycle. The abandonment of the village, the departure of its people, marks a shift in the island's life, but it is a shift that's been part of the island's story all along. The sea that provided for the villagers still moves with the same rhythm. The winds that shaped their days still blow across the hills, and the land that once supported them is now a sanctuary for nature to reclaim and renew. In the distance, we see the cliffs that rise sharply from the sea, towering over the village, as they have for centuries. The rocky outcrops, jagged and ancient, have seen generations come and go, their faces unfamiliar but their presence no less meaningful. The cliffs have been the steadfast observers of the island's history, standing guard over the village and the lives it sheltered. Now, as we look out at the distant horizon, it's easy to imagine that the cliffs will stand long after the last whispers of the village have faded. The wildflowers that grow in the overgrown garden, the tall grasses that have overtaken the paths, and the trees that have crept through the ruins all remind us that life, though fleeting, is always in motion. Even in the absence of the villagers, the island continues to evolve. The once pristine harbour, though silent, still feels alive. Its still waters a mirror for the sky above, the same sky that the villagers once watched, waiting for boats to return, for the weather to change, and for the rhythm of their lives to continue. Now, the harbour's quietude is filled with the steady pulse of nature itself, the ebb and flow of the tides, the flutter of seabirds' wings, and the rustling of leaves in the wind. The story of the abandoned village is one that resonates deeply with all who walk its silent streets. The village may be forgotten by many, its people long gone, but it is not lost. The memories, the lives lived here, continue to be woven into the fabric of the island, held in the land, in the sea, and in the quiet, shifting rhythms of time. It's as if the village has become one with the island itself, its past not erased, but absorbed into the very bones of the land. The village is not gone, it is simply resting, waiting for those who are willing to listen, to see, and to remember. As we walk along the shoreline, leaving the village behind, the wind begins to pick up, carrying with it the salty scent of the sea. The sound of the waves becomes a familiar, soothing lullaby, and the open expanse of the ocean stretches out before us, infinite and timeless. The village, now a part of the island's history, rests quietly in the shadows of the cliffs, its stories carried in the whispers of the wind and the distant calls of the seabirds. In the silence of this place, we understand that the village is not forgotten. It is simply part of the island's ongoing journey. The memory of those who once lived here lingers, held in the land they cultivated, the homes they built, and the waters they sailed. Though they are no longer here, their lives are a part of the island's soul, embedded in the very earth and sea. And as we leave, we carry a quiet gratitude for the lives that once filled these empty streets, for the enduring spirit of the island that continues to hold their memory, and for the peaceful stillness that allows us to reflect on their story. The sea remains, the wind continues to blow, and the island stands, its empty village no longer filled with people, but filled with stories. Stories that we can visit if we listen closely enough. For the island, though abandoned, still speaks quietly, reverently, and always with a sense of remembrance. Like a page turned, the last story fades, but the book is far from finished. Another chapter is waiting just ahead, its words sharper, its truths heavier, its presence impossible to ignore. This is the Clocktowers of Ghent, timekeepers of a Flemish city's daily heartbeat. The city of Ghent in Flanders is not the kind of place that needed to invent drama. It already had more than enough. Medieval merchants jostled for influence with bishops, guilds, and occasionally whichever duke or king thought he owned the place this decade. Out of that mix rose towers, and not just decorative ones. These towers were the city's clocks, its loud metallic lungs, breathing the hours into the lives of ordinary citizens. At the center of them all stood the belfry of Ghent, a grey sentinel that began as a simple defensive lookout and evolved into a kind of timekeeping monarch. If stone could wag a finger and scold you for being late to mass, this one would have done it. The belfry started humbly enough in the early 14th century. The city fathers, who were mostly guild leaders and wealthy cloth merchants, the people who really moved money in Ghent, decided a free city needed a free tower. Construction began around 1313. They did not rush. Medieval building projects were never rushed, unless someone's relative was being held hostage and a ransom needed raising. The belfry went up stone by stone, course by course, partly as a symbol of civic pride, partly because nothing shouted independence like ringing your own bell, instead of borrowing the bishop's. To put it gently, the church had enough bells already. The citizens of Ghent wanted their own voice in the sky. The bell itself was called Roland, because of course, a bell that size deserved a name.
Roland was cast in 1314 and had the lungs of 1,000 brass bands. When it rang, you didn't just hear it, you felt it through your ribcage, a gentle reminder that your local council cared enough to interrupt your thoughts at regular intervals. The bell served as both a curfew keeper and an alarm system. Fire in the city, Roland thundered. Enemy troops spotted, Roland bellowed again. Market opening, Roland chimed with more restraint, but you got the idea. Time and safety were welded together in the sound of one enormous, very opinionated bell.
As the tower climbed higher, it developed a double life. Yes, it was there to display the civic charter, a copy of Ghent's hard-won privileges. Yes, it was a lookout against threats, but it was also a kind of clock before clocks became reliable. The earliest mechanical timekeepers were inconsistent contraptions, so Roland's voice became the closest thing to standardized scheduling. In an age when pocket watches were science fiction and sundials only worked when the sun cooperated, the belfry did the heavy lifting of communal time. The building was not merely a tower stuck in the middle of cobblestones. At its feet grew the cloth hall, a space where merchants could argue about wool and prices while Roland loomed overhead. This combination of commerce and clock tower was typical for Flemish cities, where civic independence was expressed as much in trade negotiations as in architecture. It also ensured that if your business meeting ran long, you could not pretend you didn't notice the bell. The building itself tattled on your lateness. The 14th and 15th centuries rolled along, and Ghent became one of the richest cities in northern Europe. Wealth brought guild rivalries, labor, unrest, and occasional armed rebellion. But through it all, the belfry rang on. It witnessed uprisings against counts and dukes, treaties signed under duress, and the kind of municipal drama that makes modern office politics look tame. The bells told people when to work, when to worship, when to defend their walls, and occasionally when to surrender them. And while kings could ride into town and declare their authority, they could not easily silence Roland. Bells had a way of speaking louder than decrees. Timekeeping itself was a developing science. Early mechanical clocks were prone to drifting, literally sometimes as weight slipped or gears wore down. Cities like Ghent invested heavily in maintaining their clockworks because prestige was on the line. Imagine being the town whose bell rang out of sync with the neighbors. Merchants would notice, priests would complain, rival cities would snicker, so Ghent hired skilled clockmakers, who tinkered with gears and escapements while probably muttering about how no one appreciates their genius until the bell rings late. Slowly, the belfry transformed from a defensive tower with a bell to a full civic clock tower, complete with mechanisms that attempted to tame the slippery concept of time. As centuries drifted onward, the bells grew in number and ambition. By the 16th century, Ghent had embraced the carillon, a whole orchestra of tuned bells operated by a keyboard. The effect was that the belfry could now not only shout at you, but also serenade you with melodies, though serenade may be too generous a term if you were trying to sleep during a late rehearsal. Carillons became status symbols across the Low Countries. The bigger your carillon, the louder your claim to urban sophistication. Ghent, never shy, made sure its tower joined the chorus. Bells played folk tunes, hymns, and even secular ditties, transforming the air above the city into a kind of public radio service, except you couldn't turn it off. The belfry's role as timekeeper was not always universally adored. People who lived nearby occasionally grumbled about being jolted awake at ungodly hours by some earnest bell ringer practicing scales. But civic pride outweighed personal irritation. The tower was the city's beating clock, its neutral referee in disputes about schedules. It rang for coronations, it rang for wars, it rang when plague stalked the streets, as if the sound could reassure citizens that time continued even when life seemed fragile. Bells did not cure disease, but they did fill the silence. The Reformation added its own complications. Like much of Flanders, wrestled with waves of Protestant and Catholic contention. Sometimes the belfry's bells celebrated a Catholic Mass. Sometimes they tolled for Protestant gatherings. Occasionally they rang to announce the arrival of soldiers sent to stop either side. Through fire and iconoclasm, the tower endured. Roland and his smaller companions became both instruments of faith and stubborn reminders of civic identity. Whatever creed ruled the streets below, the tower remained the voice above. By the 17th century, Ghent had settled into a less rebellious rhythm, though not always a peaceful one. The belfry's role as a civic watchdog remained essential. Its bells called citizens to arms during foreign wars, and sounded alarms during fires that threatened the wooden roofs of half the city. Each ring was part of the daily texture of life. Children grew up, measuring days by its tones. Market women adjusted stalls when they heard its cues. Bakers, blacksmiths, and bankers all lived in a world structured by metallic echoes from on high. Time was no longer a private thing, marked by the sun's angle or your own stomach's rumbling. It was communal, and it was enforced with bronze insistence. Meanwhile, technology marched on. Clock mechanism improved, pendulums arrived, and accuracy became less elusive. The tower's caretakers, called carillonneurs, were half musicians, half engineers, responsible for both maintaining the machine and coaxing music from the bells. It was a prestigious role, though also one that guaranteed your neighbors knew exactly how well or poorly you played. Over centuries, families sometimes passed the job down, creating dynasties of bell players, whose main legacy was that everyone within earshot of Ghent's centre remembered their performances, whether fondly or with polite tolerance, even as Ghent's political fortunes waxed and waned, sometimes under Spanish rule, sometimes French, sometimes under the Austrian Habsburgs. The belfry remained stubbornly local. Empires could change flags on the citadel, but the bells still rang out on the hour. It was a quiet form of resistance. No matter who claimed authority, the rhythm of Ghent's daily life was still measured in its own tones. To silence Roland would have been to silence the city's identity, and rulers rarely dared. Over time, the tower itself acquired embellishments. A dragon weather vane perched at the top, glaring down at the rooftops like a mythical guardian. The dragon was gilded, because nothing announces wealth like decorating your civic alarm system with gold leaf. That glittering figure became as recognizable as the tower's bells, a symbol stamped on city seals and flags. Children no doubt grew up with mixed feelings about it, half proud, half slightly unnerved that a metal dragon claimed their skyline. By the 18th century, the belfry was old but still commanding. Its stones had darkened with soot. Its bells bore the marks of recasting, but it remained the city's timekeeper. Visitors from abroad marveled at the carillon concerts, which had by now become regular events. Travel writers of the Enlightenment noted that Ghent's bells played with both vigor and sophistication, and one imagines the townsfolk nodding politely at such reviews, as if to say, "Yes, we've been doing this for centuries. Welcome to the club." And so the belfry of Ghent, born in medieval turbulence, settled into its long life as the voice of the city. Its rhythms were steady, even when history was not. While wars raged, rulers shifted, and fortunes rose and fell, the bells kept time. They were the heartbeat of a city that insisted on being heard, not just in trade and politics, but in sound. The belfry was a reminder that in Ghent, time belonged to everyone, carried on the air whether you wanted it or not, drifting from the belfry's ringing presence. The story slides naturally into the building that hugged its base. The cloth hall. Gongen's medieval wealth came less from heroic battles and more from wool. Flemish cloth was Europe's luxury fabric of choice, and the hall was its temple. Beneath vaulted ceilings and stone arches, merchants measured bolts, compared weaves, and haggled with the sharpness of surgeons. Time in this hall was money in its most literal form, and the belfry's bells above were the referee. When the bell struck to open trade, you had to be ready with your wares. When it tolled the closing hour, no amount of pleading could stretch the day further. The building's design deliberately attached commerce to civic pride, as if to say, our wealth is not just private fortune, but the heartbeat of the entire city. The hall was not some small market stall under an awning. It sprawled, an elongated stone body connected to the tower's spine. In those chambers, international trade took on a local accent. Wool from England, dyes from Italy, and skills from generations of Flemish weavers all converged. Buyers from as far as the Hanseatic cities came to Ghent, pockets heavy with coin, ready to strike deals under Roland's audible supervision. You could not escape the sense that time itself was watching your negotiation. Linger too long, and the bells reminded you that opportunity was slipping. Time and textiles intertwined. This attachment of bells to business had social implication. Workers' days were structured by the clock tower. A weaver could no longer decide to linger in bed until the sun reached a certain angle. The bell told him when to rise, when to join his guildmates, and when to stop. Housewives marked the hours to prepare meals. Apprentices dreaded the sound that announced their master was waiting. The carillon became a musical metronome for daily existence, making Ghent one of the first places in Europe where mechanical time pressed itself onto ordinary lives. In a quiet way, it was revolutionary. Before, time was elastic. After, it was standardized, and Roland was the enforcer. Yet beneath the economic bustle lay tension. Guilds were powerful, and Ghent was not shy about confronting overlords. The belfry, with its civic charter locked inside, symbolized rights that townspeople were prepared to defend, sometimes with arms. sometimes with stubborn strikes. Whenever a count or duke tried to squeeze more taxes from the cloth trade, the tower loomed like a stone lawyer ready to cite precedents. The bells could call craftsmen to rally, and more than once they did. If the cloth hall was Ghent's treasury, the belfry was its siren, ensuring that grievances could be amplified until even distant rulers heard them. During the 15th century, the tension between Ghent's independence and Burgundian authority became especially sharp. The Dukes of Burgundy had inherited the Low Countries and wanted obedience. Ghent preferred negotiation, or failing that, open defiance. In 1453, Charles the Bold's father, Philip the Good, marched an army against Ghent. The city's militia gathered beneath the belfry's shadow. Roland rang out warnings as the conflict escalated into the Battle of Gavere. Ghent lost, brutally, but the tower survived. Bells are remarkably resilient to politics. They wait patiently for victors to depart and then resume ringing. Citizens may have been chastened, but the carillon continued as if to whisper rulers come and go, but ours remain. The Reformation brought another wave of turbulence to both hall and tower. Merchants converted, priests resisted, iconoclasts smashed religious statues, and the bells rang over it all. Calvinists even took control of Ghent for a time in the 16th century, turning churches into stark meeting halls. Through that, the belfry remained a civic rather than religious tower, and so escaped some of the worst fury of iconoclasts. Roland was too civic-minded to be targeted. It spoke for the city itself, not just a creed. When Spanish forces eventually reasserted control, the bells simply adjusted their repertoire. Flexibility in music, it turned out, was a survival strategy. It is easy to forget that the belfry was not unique. Cities across Flanders built their own towers, each with bells, each declaring autonomy. Bruges, Ypres, Leuven, all had their clock towers. But Ghent was distinctive for its height, its dragon weather vane, and its sheer persistence. Rivalries developed, not only in trade but in musicality. Carillonneurs competed, consciously or not, to show which city had the most refined bell concerts. Travelers wrote admiringly, but sometimes with hints of fatigue, about long recitals drifting across rooftops. Imagine being a farmer's cow, serenaded against its will by civic pride in bronze. One suspects the animals were unimpressed. As centuries crept forward, the cloth hall itself lost some of its luster. Trade patterns shifted, wars disrupted markets, and Ghent's primacy declined compared to Antwerp or Amsterdam. But the tower above refused to fade. Even when the hall grew dusty, its shops shuttered, the belfry remained the visible and audible soul of the city. In the 18th century, civic leaders commissioned restorations, determined that if trade no longer made Ghent the richest city, at least its bell tower would remind everyone it once had been. The carillon became less about regulating cloth sales and more about heritage, a bridge between present respectability and past grandeur. By the 19th century, industrialization had reshaped Ghent. Textile factories were powered not by guild traditions, but by steam. Yet even in this machine age, the old belfry continued. The bells now chimed above smokestacks and rail stations. Workers still glanced up when they heard Roland, though factory whistles increasingly competed for auditory authority. Some even argued that the tower had outlived its practical function, but symbolism rarely retires. The belfry became an emblem of continuity, a reminder that, while modern machines could tell time more precisely, none could bind a community together through shared sound. Quite like an ancient carillon, restoration projects in the 19th century sought to preserve the medieval flavor, though with romantic exaggeration. Architects rebuilt sections in a neo-Gothic style, indulging a taste for pointy arches and elaborate tracery that medieval masons might not have recognized. Tourists loved it, locals tolerated it. Roland endured. By now the bell was centuries old, its voice mellowed by recastings, but still clear enough to tell you when to wake, when to work, and when to reflect on the persistence of stone and bronze against the fragility of human affairs. In the 20th century, wars once again rattled Flanders. During World War I, Ghent fell under German occupation. Bells across Belgium were confiscated and melted for weapons. Roland could easily have been silenced forever, yet Ghent managed to shield its carillon, persuading occupiers that these bells were too central to civic life to destroy. Somehow, through diplomacy or luck, the belfry's music survived when so many others were lost. After the war, carillons became symbols of peace, and new compositions celebrated endurance rather than conquest. When World War II arrived, the tower again endured, scarred but standing, its bells surviving the century's madness with weary dignity. Today, the cloth hall houses exhibits, and tourists, not wool bales. The belfry still looms, its dragon gleaming after restorations, its bells tuned and ready for concerts. Modern Ghent lives with smartphones and atomic clocks, yet the carillon still plays weekly. Locals and visitors gather, sometimes consciously, sometimes by accident, to listen as melodies spill over cobbled streets. The role has shifted from timekeeping necessity to cultural heritage, but the feeling remains. These tones are not private, they belong to the city, drifting across rooftops, uninvited but welcome, a reminder that time in Ghent has always been communal. And so, even as centuries reshape politics, religion, and economy, the belfry and its hall beneath cast a shadow longer than stone. The bells still insist that history is measured not only in events, but in hours, not only in chronicles, but in rhythms. Ghent's heartbeat continues, metallic and unhurried, keeping pace with a world that too often forgets how to pause. Drifting further into the life of the belfry, one notices that the tower's most persistent companions were not the merchants in the cloth hall, or the soldiers who marched beneath its shadow, but rather the carroneurs who kept its voice alive. These musicians and technicians, perched high above the city, were part craftsman, part performer, and part night watch. They climbed narrow staircases into dusty chambers, where bronze bells waited, silent until coaxed into music. Their stage was invisible, their audience unavoidable. If you lived in Ghent, you heard them whether you wished to or not. The carillon itself was not a simple instrument. It consisted of dozens of bells, each tuned with surprising accuracy for their ear, connected by wires and levers to a wooden keyboard of heavy batons. To play it, you did not delicately press keys with fingertips like a pianist. You pounded with fists and stomped pedals, striking the levers with enough force to swing the clappers. It was a full-body workout disguised as art. Carolliners developed muscular forearms, not from dueling or farming, but from insisting that the city needed its daily melodies. Visitors often climbed up to watch, astonished that something which sounded so ethereal from the street required such vigorous hammering in the tower room. Training for this odd career was long and often hereditary. Fathers taught sons, occasionally daughters, and families kept the secrets of tuning and fingering. Being a carillonneur came with prestige, though not always wealth. You were paid enough to live, but never enough to retire early. What you did gain was recognition. Every resident of Ghent, from the poorest apprentice to the richest alderman, knew when you missed a note. A carillonnier's errors were not private mistakes. They were public events, broadcast over rooftops. One imagines the pressure was enormous, yet many embraced the responsibility as part of civic pride. The belfry's bells were not their property, but they were its caretakers. The repertoire evolved with time. Early melodies were simple chimes marking the quarter hours, sometimes expanding into short hymns or folk tunes. As musical tastes shifted in the Renaissance and Baroque periods, carillonneurs added more complex arrangements. Composers wrote specifically for carillons, though always with the understanding that the instrument was heard outdoors and often competing with wind, birds, and street noise. Subtlety was a lost cause. Volume was your ally. Still, in the hands of a skilled performer, the bells could create harmonies that surprised and even moved listeners. Travelers' journals from the 17th century describe Ghent's concerts as both stirring and inescapable. Imagine wandering cobbled alleys, trying to mind your own business, when a sudden flood of metallic harmony pours down from the clouds. You could grumble, or you could surrender to the fact that the city itself was serenading you. The role of the carillonneur was not limited to concerts. They also served as guardians of civic order. The hourly strikes were automated by clockworks, but musicians still adjusted, tested, and corrected. If a mechanism failed, it was their job to ensure Roland or his companions still rang. Bells were warnings as much as entertainment. Fires, invasions, or sudden council summons all depended on swift, recognizable signals. In that sense, the carillonneur was half firefighter and half town crier, except their cries were measured in chords. Their cabin high above the city was part concert hall, part alarm station, where art and urgency coexisted uneasily. Daily life for these bellmasters was unglamorous. They lived ordinary lives in the city below, but regularly climbed into the tower for practice and performance. The staircases were steep, the chambers drafty, the equipment heavy. In winter, the cold bit through stone walls. In summer, the air turned stifling beneath the lead roof. Yet the job persisted, because to neglect the bells was to neglect the city's heartbeat. Records show families who kept the tradition across generations, stubbornly ensuring that Ghent always had someone willing to pound wood and iron in service of bronze melodies. By the 18th and 19th centuries, carillonneurs began to organize competitions and festivals. Neighboring cities boasted of their virtuosi, and Ghent's players defended their honor with elaborate recitals. Pieces were sometimes transcriptions of popular works, arias from operas, national anthems, or marches, played with the blunt timbre of bells. The effect could be comic or majestic, depending on one's mood. There was an undeniable snark to hearing delicate Italian arias, reduced to clanging chimes, echoing over horse manure and fish stalls. But this was part of the charm. The carillon translated elite art into public sound, making high culture unavoidable, even for those who had no interest in concert halls. Of course, not all citizens were grateful. Complaints about noise are as old as noise itself. Records from city councils include occasional petitions asking for fewer nocturnal chimes or more restrained practice sessions. The council typically listened politely and then declined, reasoning that civic pride outweighed sleep. One suspects that nearby residents developed selective deafness or simply adjusted their bedtime rhythms to match the bells. In a way, it created unity. Everyone in Ghent was equally at the mercy of Roland's moods. Shared inconvenience can be a powerful community bond. Carillonneurs also had to wrestle with maintenance. Bells crack, clappers wear out, Wires snap, and wooden batons splinter. Repairs required both skill and money. The city council allocated funds grudgingly, more eager to spend on walls or weapons. Yet over centuries, Ghent repeatedly invested in keeping the carillon functional. The willingness to pour resources into music during times of political or economic struggle says much about the symbolic weight of sound. Bells were not optional ornaments. They were a civic necessity, as essential as bridges or markets. Without them, time itself felt unmoored. The 20th century elevated the status of carillonneurs further. After the devastation of World War I, carillonneurs across Belgium were recast as voices of peace. International movements sponsored bell donations, and competitions flourished. Ghent's players participated in exchanges, teaching students from abroad, ensuring that the tradition spread beyond Flanders. Universities even created carillon schools, formalizing what had once been a hereditary craft. In this modern guise, Ghent's carillonneurs became ambassadors, linking their city's history to a global appreciation of bells. The experience of hearing a carillon remained curiously unchanged, though you still heard it drifting across plazas, mingling with footsteps and conversation. You could still be ambushed by a sudden melody when you thought you were merely shopping for bread, and you could still feel a faint irritation, mixed with admiration, that someone up in the clouds had chosen the soundtrack for your afternoon without consulting you. It was democracy of the oddest sort, one musician dictating a collective listening experience, sanctioned by centuries of tradition. One could say the carillonneurs of Ghent lived paradoxical lives. They were both visible and invisible. Everyone heard them, yet few saw them. Their work was intensely physical, yet the results seemed airy and weightless as they floated over rooftops. Their performances could be fleeting, vanishing in the wind, yet the institution itself endured for 7 centuries. They were custodians of time, interpreters of heritage, and occasionally unwilling alarm clocks for the city's more sensitive sleepers. So the story of the belfry is not only about stone and bronze, but about the hands and feet that gave it voice. Without carillonneurs, Roland would have been a mute giant, a bell heard only at crises. With them, the tower became a living instrument, a companion in daily life, binding Ghent together in sound. Their efforts, sometimes admired, sometimes cursed, ensured that time in Ghent was never silent, and that history itself had a soundtrack. Sliding down the centuries, one notices how the belfry of Ghent quietly inserted itself into nearly every civic quarrel. While rulers and rebels clashed on the cobblestones below, the tower stood unmoving, its bells waiting for the next cue. Time was impartial, but bells could be political. They summoned townsmen to arms. They celebrated victories, and they told with stern finality after defeats. If stone could roll its eyes at human folly, the belfry might have done so daily. Citizens were famously prickly about their liberties. In the 14th and 15th centuries, they staged repeated uprisings against their overlords, the Counts of Flanders, and later the Dukes of Burgundy, when taxes climbed too high or privileges were threatened. Guilds gathered in the market square. Roland's mighty voice boomed out, and citizens shouldered pikes. The bell was more than a timekeeper. It was a battle cry. At the Battle of Beverhoutsveld in 1382, Ghent's forces triumphed against Bruges, cheered on by the memory of their bell summons. Yet triumphs rarely lasted. At Gever in 1453, Philip the Good crushed Ghent's militia, scattering rebels who had once marched confidently to Roland's call. The bell survived, though the liberties it had proclaimed were clipped. wars rarely left the tower unscathed. During the long conflicts of the 16th century, the wars of religion and the struggle against Spanish rule, the belfry's bells rang incessantly. When Calvinists seized control of Ghent in the 1570s, Roland became their trumpet. They rang it to summon citizens to sermons stripped of ritual, and they rang it again when Spanish troops threatened to retake the city. After Alexander Farnese subdued Ghent for Spain in 1584, the bells were pressed back into Catholic service. It must have felt absurd to citizens that the same bronze clapper that had proclaimed Protestant liberty now rang obediently for the Habsburg crown. Yet such was the nature of civic bells. They spoke for whoever held the tower's keys. Still, Roland had a reputation. It was not merely another bell. It was the voice of rebellion. Authorities eyed it suspiciously, much as one might eye a neighbor known for gossip. In times of unrest, rulers considered silencing it, but such acts risked outrage. Ghent without Roland was not Ghent. To confiscate or melt it would have been like amputating the city's identity. And so, even as troops garrisoned the town and governors dictated policy, the bell remained. It strikes a reminder that no empire lasted forever, but time always did. The 17th century brought more wars. Spanish, French, Dutch, take your pick, but the belfry endured them all. When Louis XIV's armies swept into Flanders, citizens listened anxiously as the bells told news of sieges and occupations. Soldiers came and went, banners changed, but the tower's music floated on, both indifferent and stubborn. It was as if Roland refused to choose sides, ringing with the same booming impartiality whether the city paid taxes to Madrid, Paris, or Vienna. Napoleon's arrival in the 1790s brought a new order. The French Revolution had little patience for feudal relics, and many bells across Belgium were melted into cannon. Roland narrowly escaped, either through bureaucratic oversight, local persuasion, or sheer luck. Ghent's great bell remained in its tower. Thus, even when Napoleon's soldiers drilled in the squares below, the bell that had once rung against Burgundian dukes and Spanish kings still presided, an elderly survivor humming through the tumult. The 19th century layered on, yet more drama. Belgium declared independence in 1830, and once again bells rang as heralds of change. Ghent's belfry joined the chorus, not with the furious clangor of medieval revolt, but with dignified celebration. Independence brought pride, but also nostalgia. Romantic writers and painters rediscovered the medieval city, praising its towers and guild halls. The belfry became less a functional war trumpet and more a symbol of continuity. Guides explained its rebellious past with a wink, as if to say, once upon a time, this stone giant gave orders that shook empires. Now it was content to shake pigeon. The Second World War brought a repeat performance. Occupation, fear, and the constant threat of confiscation. Again, the belfry endured. When liberation came in 1944, the bells rang out with ferocity, echoing across the city like an old soldier remembering former glories. For citizens, it was a reassurance that while regimes rose and fell, the bronze voice of Ghent was still there, stubbornly patient, keeping time. It is easy to imagine Roland, if it could feel, sighing in its clapper. Wars came like tides, drowning the city in slogans and uniforms. Then receding, the bell's job never changed. Strike the hours, call the people, sing when asked, and when dust settled, resume the quiet work of reminding humans that time is larger than their quarrels. Empires had tried to claim it, rebels had tried to wield it, and occupiers had nearly destroyed it. Yet across 6 centuries, it endured. By the time peace settled more permanently in the late 20th century, Roland had become less a rebel and more a grandparent, still loud, still opinionated, but respected for longevity rather than militancy. Carillon concerts drew audiences not to rally but to relax. Children listened wide-eyed, tourists took photographs, and locals shrugged affectionately. The bell had shouted enough in its youth. Now it hummed tunes of memory. And so the belfry's story through revolts and wars shows not just survival, but stubborn patience. It watched generations promise glory, suffer defeat, rebuild, and forget. All the while it kept its rhythm, stone and bronze, impartial and enduring. It reminded Ghent that even when human affairs unravel, time continues, and the hours must still be struck. Drifting out of the age of wars, one finds the belfry and its bells settling into a quieter, though no less symbolic rhythm. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the tower became less a tool of civic urgency and more a monument to memory. No longer did Roland's bellows summon guild militias or announce foreign invasions. Instead, it chimed for festivals, commemorations, and weekly concerts, gently rebranding itself as a cultural elder rather than a militant youth, for a city that had once lived by its bronze heartbeat. This was not retirement so much as transformation. Restorations became a constant theme. Stone weathers, slowly, but centuries of smoke, soot, and war damage left scars on the belfry. Architects and engineers took turns patching, rebuilding, and occasionally over-romanticizing the structure. 19th century restorers had already indulged their neo-Gothic fantasies, adding decorative flourishes that medieval masons might have found extravagant. 20th century efforts were more careful, focusing on structural stability and historical accuracy. By the late 1900s, the belfry gleamed again, its dragon weather vane refurbished and gilded, its bells retuned for clarity. Tourists could climb its stairs, gaze out over red-tiled roofs, and hear the carillon from the very chamber where centuries of carillons had hammered melodies into the air. The carillon concerts shifted into new contexts. Once a means of structuring daily life, the music became a blend of heritage performance and living tradition. Carillons still pounded wooden batons with their fists, but now they mixed ancient hymns with modern tunes, sometimes slipping in popular songs to amuse listeners on the square. It was a reminder that heritage does not have to be solemn. Bells that had tolled for revolts could just as easily chime a waltz or a film theme. The sound carried the same weight of centuries, but with a playful wink, as if Roland and his companions had decided that after 700 years of politics, they were entitled to a little fun. The role of the tower as timekeeper shifted, as well, in a world where everyone carried watches, and later smartphones. No one truly relied on Roland to know the hour, yet the bell still struck, its voice redundant, but welcome. It became a reassurance, not an instruction. People did not adjust their routines to its command. They smiled at its familiarity. The sound confirmed continuity, whispering that while devices and lifestyles changed, the city's bronze voice remained steady. Even when ignored, it created a kind of background stability. Recognition came in official form. In 1999, UNESCO added the Belfry of Ghent, along with other Flemish belfries, to its World Heritage list. The designation was not only about architecture, but about what the towers represented: communal independence, civic pride, and the long history of shared time. Ghent's belfry was singled out as one of the finest, a model of how a city could build a monument that was practical, symbolic, and beautiful all at once. For the citizens, the award was less surprising than affirming. They had always known the tower mattered. Now the world admitted it too. Visitors today climb its 91 meters, winding through staircases that feel more like tunnels in stone. Along the way, exhibits explain the history, the original charters once stored inside, the dragon that has kept watch since the 14th century, the guilds that built and defended it, the carillonneurs who gave it voice. At the top, the view stretches across the old city centre, St. Nicholas's Church, St. Bivo's Cathedral, rooftops clustered like children around their elder. The belfry is not the tallest structure in Europe, not even in Flanders, but from its summit, one feels a sense of timelessness, as though standing inside the very lungs of the city. Local festivals still lean on the belfry. During Ghent's summer celebrations, carillon concerts fill the air, sometimes blending with jazz bands or choirs in the squares below. Bells that once signaled curfew now mingle with laughter, beer glasses, and open-air stages. The continuity is ironic, but also comforting. What began as stern commands has become joyful accompaniment. The belfry did not lose authority so much as evolve into a companion. The sound remains inescapable, but now it is less about obedience and more about atmosphere. The modern relationship between Ghent's people and their tower is tender, even if tinged with irony. Locals joke about being woken by over-enthusiastic recitals, but they also defend the carillon fiercely. Proposals to limit performances, usually made by newcomers craving quieter mornings, are met with raised eyebrows. After all, the bells were here first. To live in Ghent is to accept their company, like adopting a very old, very loud roommate who insists on narrating the hours. Complaints rarely last. Affection usually wins. In this softened role, the belfry demonstrates the persistence of civic symbols. What once was the city's defensive trumpet is now its cultural lullaby. Children grow up recognizing the sound, tourists carry recordings home, and historians continue to mine its story for insights into how time shaped community. The belfry proves that monuments need not be frozen relics. They can adapt, shifting from war cries to peace songs, from urgent commands to playful melodies. And so the tower endures. Stone walls, bronze bells, and a gilded dragon, rising above streets that long ago stopped obeying its schedule, yet still look up at its silhouette with affection. In the silence of dawn, Roland waits, as it always has, ready to mark the next hour. No one truly needs it, and yet everyone feels its absence would wound the city. That paradox is the essence of heritage, the unnecessary made essential by memory. Ghent's clocktowers remind us that time is not just measured, but shared. The belfry's voice carries across markets, squares, and alleys, flattening distinctions between noble and commoner, tourist and local. For centuries it has told the same truth. You live here, together, under these hours. And though you may quarrel, revolt, rebuild, or forget, the bells will continue, impartial and insistent, until the stones themselves crumble. The story of the belfry of Ghent is therefore not only about architecture or mechanics, nor even about history's rebellions and wars. It is about endurance. A city poured its pride into stone and bronze, and centuries later, the structure still speaks. Its voice has outlasted dukes, emperors, generals, and factory whistles. It is the slow pulse of continuity, the echo that reminds Ghent each day that it has been many things but always itself. When one tale slips into memory, another rises to take its place. History never pauses, it only reshapes itself, preparing us for something wilder, stranger, and far more unexpected. This is Ye hidden libraries of Timbuktu, guardians of knowledge in the sands. In the heart of Mali, where the Niger River curls like a lazy ribbon before evaporating into desert, sits the city of Timbuktu. The name has long been a byword for remoteness, as if it were a myth invented by geographers with too much time on their hands. Yet Timbuktu is very real, and for centuries, it was less about remoteness and more about convergence, a meeting place where trade, scholarship, and faith entwine. Its true treasures were not only the salt slabs or gold dust that merchants carried across Saharan routes, but also the books carefully copied by hand, sheltered in libraries built from mud brick walls that blended with the sand around them. The story of Timbuktu's libraries begins in the 13th and 14th centuries, when the Mali Empire, swollen with wealth from trans-Saharan commerce, encouraged learning as much as trading. The city flourished under Mansa Musa, the emperor famous for carrying so much gold to Cairo on his pilgrimage that he deflated the Egyptian economy for years afterward. Musa was not just a man of gold, he was a patron of scholars. He founded mosques, including the Jingar Froba Mosque, and drew architects, jurists, and teachers to his desert outpost. Books arrived strapped to camels alongside sacks of grain and bolts of cloth. Manuscripts were bought, sold, and copied, turning Timbuktu into a hub where the value of ink sometimes outweighed that of gold. The manuscripts themselves covered everything from theology to astronomy, law to medicine, poetry to mathematics. They were written in Arabic, the scholarly lingua franca of the Islamic world, but also in Ajami, local languages transcribed in Arabic script. Some were original works by West African scholars. Others were copies of treatises from Cairo, Fez, or even Cordoba. Collecting them was not simply an academic hobby, but an act of prestige. Wealthy families measured their influence, not only in cattle or caravans, but in volumes stacked in their private libraries. Owning rare manuscripts was a statement. Here lived people who could afford knowledge as well as goods. The libraries were rarely monumental in size. They were tucked into family compounds, shelves carved into plaster walls, niches shaded from desert heat. Some families guarded collections across generations, treating them as heirlooms more valuable than jewelry. The act of copying was itself devotion. Scribes bent over parchment by flickering lamplight, dipping pens into ink mixed from soot or plants, producing elegant calligraphy that sometimes wandered into margin notes. Those notes are little gifts for modern historians, offering glimpses of daily life, a scholar jotting a proverb, a scribe noting the date of a local festival, even a casual complaint about the price of ink. By the 15th and 16th centuries, Timbuktu reached its scholarly zenith. The city's three great race, Jingwerber, Sankore, and Sidi Yahya, anchored an intellectual network that drew students from across West Africa. The Sankore Mosque, in particular, evolved into a center sometimes described as a university, though it lacked the formal bureaucracy of European models. Instead, it was a constellation of teachers and students, studying under the shade of adobe walls, reciting text, debating points of law, memorizing passages. Knowledge flowed orally as much as through written texts, but manuscripts remained the physical backbone, anchoring scholarship to the page. The scholars of Timbuktu were not ivory tower dreamers removed from the world. They were deeply entangled in law, governance, and trade. Judges relied on books of jurisprudence. Merchants consulted treatises on contracts. Physicians applied remedies copied from distant sources, but adapted to local plants. Astronomy was studied for religious reasons. The timing of prayers and Ramadan, but also for navigation across the desert. In this way, the manuscripts were both universal and local, weaving global traditions into the specific fabric of West African life. Centuries drifted onward, and Timbuktu faded from the major trade routes. European ships redirected commerce along the Atlantic coast, bypassing caravan hubs. The city's wealth diminished, and its reputation in Europe transformed into that of a mysterious lost city. Travelers fantasized about golden streets, unaware that the true gold lay in inked parchments. The libraries remained, but they were no longer centers of active scholarship. Families still guarded their collections, but many volumes slept quietly, wrapped in cloth, concealed in trunks, and forgotten by outsiders. When European explorers finally reached Timbuktu in the 19th century, they were often disappointed. They found no streets paved with gold, only mud walls and dusty markets. Some noticed manuscripts but dismissed them as curiosities. Others realized their significance but lacked the means or interest to preserve them. In one of history's dry ironies, while Europe boasted of rediscovering ancient Greek texts during its Renaissance, it ignored the fact that Timbuktu had been safeguarding its own libraries of learning for centuries. It was only in the 20th century that scholars began to grasp the scale of what had been preserved. Researchers catalogued thousands of manuscripts held by families who had quietly protected them through wars, droughts, and neglect. Collections like those of the Ahmed Baba Institute were established to conserve and study the texts. The work was painstaking. Manuscripts had to be coaxed back from households where they were still regarded as private heirloom. Negotiations required diplomacy, respect, and sometimes financial compensation. For families, parting with books was like parting with ancestors. Yet without centralized care, the manuscripts faced destruction from termites, mold, or simple decay. Even then, challenges abounded. Preservation required not just conservation techniques, but also climate control in a city that still baked under Saharan heat. Resources were scarce, funding inconsistent, and political instability frequent. The manuscripts were fragile survivors, living on borrowed time, yet their endurance was already remarkable. Few places in the world could boast such a concentration of pre-modern African scholarship. They were proof that West Africa was not an intellectual backwater, as colonial stereotypes once suggested, but a region deeply engaged with global knowledge traditions. The manuscripts of Timbuktu tell a story not only of scholarship, but of resilience. Families across generations kept them safe, sometimes burying them during invasions, sometimes smuggling them across dunes, sometimes tucking them into cellars. As storms raged above, their guardianship was quiet, but steadfast, motivated less by fame than by reverence. In this sense, the hidden libraries were not just about ink on parchment, but about faith in the value of knowledge itself. And so, as the desert drifted against the city walls, as empires rose and fell, as trade routes shifted and storms eroded, Timbuktu's manuscripts endured. They slept in trunks, they whispered in margins, they traveled on camelback, and they waited in their silence. They carried the weight of centuries, guarding fragments of human thought against the sands, sliding from the great mosques and scholarly circles. The story drifts into the quieter spaces of Timbuktu, into courtyards and mud brick homes where families kept their most precious inheritance, not in gold coins or jewelry, but in stacks of manuscripts. These households became the true guardians of knowledge. When the city's glory receded, scholars might have dispersed, rulers might have shifted, but families remained, stubbornly protecting their shelves of parchment, even when no one outside seemed to care. Many lineages in Timbuktu became famous for their collections. The Haidara family, for instance, maintained a library that grew across generations, passing manuscripts from father to son like sacred relics. The Kati family, descended partly from Andalusian migrants, preserved works that bridged Islamic Spain and West Africa, embodying centuries of cultural exchange. The Mama Haidara Library, the Fondo Kati Library, and others were not grand institutions in the European sense, but rather family compounds where knowledge lived alongside daily chores, meals, and prayers. One could imagine a grandmother stirring millet in a courtyard while behind a mud wall, priceless 15th century treatises slumbered in silence. The manuscripts themselves were eclectic. Some contained commentaries on the Quran, carefully annotated in elegant script. Others recorded histories of local rulers, blending chronicle and memory. There were treatises on jurisprudence, poems on ethics, guides for merchants, text on astronomy mapping the stars above the Sahara, and medical recipes recommending herbs for fevers. In some, the edges were worn by fingers that turned pages in the 16th century, leaving smudges that still linger. A few bore illustrations, geometric diagrams, astrological charts, stylized calligraphy that offered flashes of artistry amid the text. Each book was unique, a handmade object that reflected the care and context of its creator. What is striking is how ordinary families accepted the burden of protecting them. When Moroccan troops invaded in 1591, some households buried their manuscripts in sand or hid them in ceiling spaces. During later wars, bundles of books were carried across dunes on camelback, disguised as sacks of grain. At times of drought or famine, when selling manuscripts could have brought food, many families resisted. To them, books were not commodities, but legacies. Their value was measured not in coins but in continuity. One family might whisper to another, "We still have the commentary on Malachite law that our grandfather copied." And so the manuscript lived on, even if hunger pressed hard. Of course, not all books survived. Termites found their way into trunks, ink faded, pages crumbled in humidity. Some were lost in fires or stolen by traders who carried them north. Yet the survival rate remains astonishing. Estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of manuscripts have endured. For centuries they were unknown to the outside world, hidden behind mud walls while European travelers spun tales of Timbuktu as an empty myth. The irony is sharp. At the very moment outsiders dismissed the city as backward or forgotten, families inside were sitting on one of the richest caches of pre-modern African literature. The guardianship carried social weight. Families that maintained large libraries were respected, their status tied not only to wealth, but to knowledge. Owning books implied literacy, learning, and authority. A merchant might boast of his caravan, but a scholar's son could point to manuscripts that proved generations of intellectual contribution. Over time, some families became less wealthy in material terms, but remained honored for their collections. The manuscripts were anchors of dignity in an uncertain world. Colonial encounters added another layer of complexity. In the 19th and 20th centuries, French administrators and scholars began cataloging the manuscripts, sometimes with genuine interest, sometimes with an air of condescension. Families were wary. They had heard stories of colonial powers seizing treasures, and they hesitated to reveal their holdings. Negotiations were delicate. Some manuscripts were shown, others hidden. Trust came slowly, if at all. Even today, many families retain manuscripts in private homes, reluctant to relinquish them entirely to state institutions. The challenges of preservation were immense. Timbuktu's climate was not kind to parchment and paper. Dust, heat, insects, and occasional floods gnawed at the manuscripts year after year. Families did what they could, wrapping books in cloth, stacking them in chests, moving them during storms. But without modern conservation tools, damage was inevitable. Scholars visiting in the 20th century often described rooms filled with manuscripts in precarious conditions, brittle pages, ink bleeding, bindings loose. Yet even in fragility, the manuscripts retained their aura. They were survivors, and survival was victory. The 20th century brought moments of renewal. With independence in 1960, Mali began to rediscover its own intellectual heritage. The Ahmed Baba Institute was founded in 1973 to collect and preserve manuscripts named after a 17th century Timbuktu scholar whose works embodied the city's intellectual spirit. Families began cautiously contributing manuscripts, though never all at once. Trust, after centuries of guarding, was not easily surrendered. Still, slowly, collections grew in the institute, and scholars began to study the texts systematically. The process revealed just how vast Timbuktu's hidden libraries were. Tens of thousands of manuscripts were catalogued, with topics ranging far beyond religion. There were letters between rulers, contracts detailing salt shipments, philosophical reflections, and even guides on how to maintain gardens in desert soil. The manuscripts painted a portrait of a city deeply engaged with the world, conversant with ideas from across the Islamic world, yet rooted in its own African context. They undermined stereotypes of Africa as a continent without written tradition. Timbuktu's pages told another story, one of literacy, scholarship, and cultural sophistication stretching back centuries. For the families who had guarded them, the manuscript's rediscovery brought pride, but also anxiety. On one hand, recognition validated their centuries of stewardship. On the other, exposure risked theft, exploitation, or neglect. Some worried that outside scholars might value the texts more than the descendants of those who wrote them. These tensions continue today, as debates swirl over whether manuscripts should remain in private hands, in national institutions, or even in international repositories with better conservation tools. Yet beneath the debates lies a simple truth. Without the families, there would be no manuscripts. For centuries, while empires collapsed and colonial borders shifted, while outsiders doubted the city's very existence, ordinary households in Timbuktu protected their fragile pages. They did so not for fame, not for wealth, but because they believed that knowledge mattered. They believed that to lose the books was to lose themselves. And in that quiet conviction, they ensured that one of the world's greatest hidden libraries survived. Drifting now from the families who guarded the manuscripts, one begins to notice the men whose names filled their pages. Timbuktu's scholars were never cloistered monks, detached from daily life. They were judges, poets, physicians, and teachers whose authority extended from the study hall into the marketplace and even the palace. Their words shaped the rhythm of justice, commerce, and faith across West Africa. To understand the libraries, one must understand the scholars who gave them meaning. Among the most famous was Ahmed Baba, born in 1556, a jurist and theologian whose writings covered law, grammar, and biography. His life reflected both the brilliance and the vulnerability of Timbuktu's intellectual class. After the Moroccan invasion in 1591, Ahmed Baba was deported to Marrakesh, where he lived in exile for years. Far from silencing him, the experience broadened his reputation. He wrote extensively, producing fatus and treatises that circulated widely. earning him respect even from those who had conquered his city. When he returned to Timbuktu, he continued teaching, his very survival a testament to resilience. Today, the Ahmed Bababey Institute bears his name as a reminder that scholarship can endure even when armies disrupt everything else.
And Mubaba was not alone.
Timbuktu produced generations of thinkers whose names may be less known, but whose works filled the shelves. Scholars such as Mahmud Kati, often associated with the Tariq al-Fatesh, a chronicle of West African history, or Abdurrahman al-Sadi, author of the Tariq al-Sudan, offered narratives that combined local memory with Islamic historiography. These chronicles are among the most important written sources for the history of the Sahel, tracing lineages of rulers, wars, and migrations. They remind us that Timbuktu's manuscripts were not just abstract philosophy, but also living history, recording the lives of kings and commoners who otherwise would have vanished into oral legend. The subjects of study were wide-ranging, law-dominated, particularly the Maliki school of Islamic jurisprudence, which shaped how disputes were resolved. Fatwas addressed everything from inheritance to trade ethics, from slavery to religious obligations. Medical texts combined Greco-Arabic traditions with local legal, recommending treatments that might mix imported theories with regional herbs. Astronomical treatises calculated lunar phases for the calendar, but also mapped constellations, visible in Saharan skies. Even poetry appeared, ranging from mystical Sufi verses to moral aphorisms. The variety revealed a culture that saw no contradiction between faith and inquiry, between local needs and global currents. Students flocked to Timbuktu for this learning. By the 16th century, the Sankari Mosque and its associated teaching circles attracted pupils from across the Sahel. Education was informal by modern standards. No registrars, no diplomas, but rigorous. A student apprenticed to a teacher, memorized texts, debated points of law, and gradually advanced. The goal was mastery recognized by peers, not a piece of parchment. Yet the manuscripts anchored the process. Teachers cited them, copied them, and sometimes authored new ones to clarify debates. The libraries were thus not static warehouses, but active classrooms, buzzing with the rustle of pages and the cadence of recitation. What distinguished Timbuktu's scholarship was its rootedness in the desert environment. Unlike the madrasas of Cairo or Fez, Timbuktu was not surrounded by fertile farmland or imperial capitals. It was perched on the edge of the Sahara, accessible only by caravans trudging across sand and scrub. This gave its scholarship a frontier flavor, cosmopolitan in sources, but pragmatic in application. Treatises often dealt with the specifics of caravan trade, water rights, or desert law. Timbuktu's thinkers were global citizens in terms of ideas, but local leaders in terms of practice. The scholars were also intermediaries between rulers and people. Kings and governors leaned on them to legitimize policies or resolve disputes. Their fatwas could calm unrest or stir it, depending on interpretation. This gave them power, but also made them vulnerable. When Moroccan troops invaded, they targeted scholars precisely because of their influence. Anhid Baba's exile was a reminder that books alone do not protect their authors. Yet, the manuscripts preserved their voices long after the soldiers departed. Over time, Timbuktu's intellectual radiance dimmed as political and economic fortunes declined. Yet the manuscripts ensured that its scholars were not forgotten, even when the city lost its prominence as a trade hub. Their words remained in mud wall houses, waiting for rediscovery. For modern historians, these texts are a revelation. They prove that pre-colonial West Africa was not intellectually silent. It was engaged in debates about law, science, and morality that echoed those in Cairo, Damascus, or Istanbul. Timbuktu's scholars belonged to a global conversation, even if their desks overlooked desert sands instead of river valleys. One of the quiet charms of the manuscripts is their marginalia. Scholars and students often scribbled notes in the edges of pages, offering glimpses of intellectual life beyond the formal text. A student might comment on a difficult passage, record a proverb, or note the date of a local event. These little asides breathe life into the pages. They remind us that the libraries were not lifeless archives, but living spaces of thought, shaped by human hands that occasionally grew tired, distracted, or amused. Some notes even reveal debates between generations, as later readers responded to earlier scribbles, creating a dialogue across centuries. Timbuktu's scholars were, in many ways, bridges. They connected North Africa to West Africa, the desert to the river, oral tradition to written record, faith to reason. They turned a dusty outpost into a lighthouse of knowledge whose beams stretched across continents. Their works, preserved by families, survived not because they were flawless, but because they mattered deeply to the people who copied, studied, and guarded them. And so, when we speak of the hidden libraries of Timbuktu, we are really speaking of these men and their students, of ink-stained fingers and careful handwriting, of debates carried late into the night under the flicker of lamps. Their legacy is not only in the pages, but in the stubborn idea that knowledge is worth keeping, even when empires crumble and trade routes vanish. Drifting forward into the 19th and 20th centuries, Timbuktu's hidden libraries began to slip into wider view, though rarely with the urgency they deserved. European explorers who trudged into the city in the early 1800s often left underwhelmed, muttering that the so-called fabled Timbuktu was merely a hot, dusty settlement of mud walls. They came looking for golden streets and endless riches, and so manuscripts stacked in wooden trunks looked like clutter rather than treasure. What they failed to recognize was that the true wealth of the city had always been intellectual. It was only later, as colonial scholarship developed, that a few administrators and researchers noticed the scale of the collections. They reported on manuscripts tucked into family houses, some wrapped in cloth, others piled precariously on shelves. Yet the colonial era did not exactly create ideal conditions for preservation. Funds were scarce, priorities focused elsewhere, and local families remained deeply suspicious of outsiders, having guarded their collections against Moroccan soldiers, raiders, and droughts. They had no reason to trust Europeans with better motives. The result was a tense coexistence. Libraries remained hidden, outsiders speculated, and the manuscripts survived more through inertia than systematic care. By the mid-20th century, however, the conversation began to shift. Mali gained independence in 1960, and the young state sought symbols of cultural pride. Timbuktu's manuscripts fit perfectly. In 1973, the Bar Institute was established with the goal of gathering, cataloguing, and conserving the manuscripts, named for the city's most famous scholar. The institute was meant to transform private collections into a national heritage. Gradually, manuscripts were brought in, though never all of them. Families remained protective, often handing over copies while keeping originals in their houses. Trust was slow, and perhaps rightly so. The institute itself faced chronic underfunding, struggling to keep manuscripts safe from termites and humidity. Even with these difficulties, the rediscovery of Timbuktu's libraries was a revelation. Scholars from around the world traveled to Mali to study texts that challenged stereotypes about African history. Here were works on law, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy, proving that West Africa had been deeply literate and engaged in scholarly debates centuries before colonial contact. Academic articles and exhibitions began to showcase this hidden heritage, and slowly Timbuktu's reputation shifted. No longer a punchline for remoteness, it became a symbol of intellectual resilience. Yet, the manuscripts remained vulnerable. The desert climate, never kind to paper, continued to gnaw at them. Termites worked silently, and sudden floods could destroy pages in minutes. More perilous still was political instability. In 2012, northern Mali fell into crisis as armed groups seized control of Timbuktu. For a brief and frightening period, it seemed the libraries might finally be lost. Militants targeted heritage sites, destroying mausoleums and threatening the manuscripts. To protect them, families and librarians organized a quiet rescue. Manuscripts were smuggled out in metal chests, packed into trucks, and hidden in houses along the Niger River or transported south to Bamako. Thousands of volumes were saved by this discreet effort, carried out under extreme danger. Not all manuscripts survived intact. Some were burned, others damaged in transit, and still more remained buried in hiding places vulnerable to moisture. But the scale of the rescue was astonishing. Ordinary citizens risked their lives to protect books, slipping them past checkpoints, disguising them among sacks of grain. The manuscripts had endured invasions before, and once again they outlasted soldiers who believed destruction proved authority. Their guardianship was proof of a truth Timbuktu had always known. Books can be stronger than armies if people are willing to carry them. After the crisis, attention returned with renewed urgency. Conservation projects multiplied, international funding arrived, and digitization programs began scanning pages for posterity. Yet these efforts came with their own tension. Families who had hidden manuscripts for centuries worried about losing control to foreign institutions. Some feared that digital copies might strip the texts of their local significance, turning living heritage into mere data. Others welcomed the chance to protect fragile works that might otherwise disintegrate. The debate continues, as questions of ownership, access, and identity remain unresolved. Meanwhile, researchers continue to explore the content of the manuscripts. They reveal legal debates over slavery, medical recipes for ailments, astronomical calculations of starting accuracy, and poetry that drifts between mysticism and satire. They show Timbuktu not as an isolated curiosity, but as a node in global networks of thought. Ideas traveled along the same caravan routes as salt and gold, carried in ink and memory. The rediscovery of these texts has forced historians to redraw maps of intellectual history, acknowledging that the sands of Mali once sheltered one of the world's richest archives of human thought. And yet, even as scholars celebrate, the manuscripts remain precarious. Conservation is expensive, political crises return with depressing regularity, and the desert is endlessly patient in its erosion. Timbuktu's libraries are not museums sealed off from danger. They are fragile survivors, balanced on the edge of disappearance. Their rediscovery is both triumph and warning. The world knows of them now, but knowing is not the same as protect. What endures most strongly is the devotion of the local people. Time and again, ordinary Malians have risked and sacrificed to safeguard books written centuries before. Their quiet heroism ensures that Timbuktu is not just a story of lost glories, but of ongoing resilience. The libraries remain hidden, not because no one can find them, but because their survival depends on a delicate balance between secrecy and sharing, tradition and preservation. And so, The rediscovery of Timbuktu's libraries is not a neat ending, but an ongoing drama. The pages endure, but only just. The world listens, but not always with sustained attention. The sands still wait, pressing against the walls, as if testing how long humans can hold them back. Drifting now from the crises of the recent past, we come to Timbuktu as it exists today, less a legendary city than a living one, where manuscripts still rest in courtyards and libraries, and where their meaning has shifted from secret heirlooms to public symbols of cultural pride. The world knows of them now, but their survival is not guaranteed. They continue to hover between fragility and endurance, like parchment balanced against desert winds. Modern conservation is a constant effort. In Bamako, where many manuscripts were smuggled during the 2012 crisis, conservators work in modest rooms using brushes and handmade tools to clean pages. Special boxes are built to protect fragile bindings from humidity. Digital scanners hung quietly, capturing each line of script so that, if disaster strikes, at least the words will not vanish. Yet technology alone cannot solve the problem. Electricity fails, equipment breaks, and funding is uneven. To preserve knowledge in Mali requires as much patience as ink once demanded from the scribes who copied it by hand. Local involvement remains crucial. Families still hold thousands of manuscripts in their homes, often reluctant to hand them over to institutions. They know from history that guardianship is safest when it is personal. Outsiders may promise preservation, but institutions rise and fall while families persist. Negotiations between state bodies, international organizations, and private households continue, each side tugging gently between the desire to protect and the fear of losing control. This tension is unlikely to disappear. Perhaps it should not, for it reflects the very history of Timbuktu's libraries, guarded in secret, valued in silence, passed carefully through generation. Meanwhile, the content of the manuscripts continues to surprise. Scholars pore over texts that reveal unexpected details, letters between scholars in Morocco and Mali, contracts documenting trade in salt, slaves, and cloth, treatises on astronomy that note eclipses with precision, medical recipes that combine classical theory with local plants. Even in translation, their voice is distinctive. West African scholars writing in Arabic script, but inflected with their own rhythms and concerns. They debated slavery and freedom, commerce and ethics, ritual and reason. Their world was not frozen in sand. It was dynamic, connected, and thoughtful. For Malians today, the manuscripts are more than academic resources. They are symbols of heritage, proof that their ancestors were thinkers, writers, and guardians of knowledge. In a world where colonial stereotypes once painted Africa as a continent without written history, Timbuktu's libraries stand as quiet rebuttal. Every manuscript is evidence that Africans debated law, studied the stars, and wrote poetry centuries before European explorers arrived. The pride in this legacy is palpable. Schools in Mali now teach about the manuscripts, weaving them into a broader story of national identity. And yet, the manuscripts are also reminders of vulnerability. The desert presses on. Political instability still threatens. International interest surges during crises and then ebbs. The manuscripts exist in this uneasy balance, needing attention but not always receiving it. To live in Timbuktu is to know that heritage is both a blessing and a burden. You are heir to one of the world's great archives, but you are also responsible for keeping it alive against indifferent elements and restless politics. Despite these challenges, hope persists. Digitization projects continue, creating copies accessible worldwide. International collaborations train conservators and librarians. Local families teach their children the value of what they hold, and each time a manuscript is opened, each time its script is read aloud, Timbuktu's libraries prove that they are not relics but living voices. The knowledge they contain may not transform the global economy, as salt and gold once did, but it reshapes understanding, reminding the world that wisdom has many homes, including the mud brick houses of a desert city. Perhaps that is Timbuktu's lasting gift, the insistence that knowledge is worth guarding, even when wealth fades, even when power collapses, even when sand presses in from all sides. For centuries, ordinary people believed that ink mattered more than coin, and they were right. Their conviction carried manuscripts through invasions, droughts, and indifference, until the world finally noticed. And so the story of Timbuktu's hidden libraries continues, not concluded, but ongoing. Manuscripts rest in boxes, on shelves, in trunks, waiting for careful hands to open them again. Their pages whisper across centuries, telling of scholars who measured the stars, of poets who captured longing, of jurists who weighed justice, and of families who believed that to lose a book was to lose a piece of themselves. Against the sands, against the centuries they endure, and in their endurance, they remind us all that knowledge, once written, rarely disappears. It only waits. May this story settle in your heart like a whisper, and may your dreams be calm and kind. Good night.